Well, good evening, friends. Thank you for joining us on the webinar tonight, where I will be talking about a slightly different topic from those that I normally speak of, where I'm normally talking about agronomics. A number of growers have asked me to repeat a discussion that a presentation that I first talked about at the World Ag Expo a couple of years ago, where I was asked to talk about the characteristics of exceptional farm managers and what really separates those farm managers who have an exceptional degree of success. So the the context and the history behind this really is in some of the work that we've done at Advancing Eco Agriculture over the last decade or more. When we first started with our initial consulting work and then started product development work, one of our practices was that every year at the end of a growing season, we would sit down with all of our consultants and around the table, and we would rank the success that the growers that we had were working with. And not in terms of necessarily in terms of the growers' management success or financial success or anything like that, but more specifically in terms of their agronomic success. How successful were we in producing the yield levels that we thought should be possible? And what was working? What was not working? Why was it working? Why wasn't it working? It's a very fascinating exercise. So we would rank the agronomic performance of the crops that we were working with and the farmers that we were working with on a scale of 1 to 10. And then we would group the 9s and 10s together, and we group the 1s and 2s together, and we would ask a whole set of questions about these various groups. We would ask, okay, what are the similarities between the 9s and 10s? What characteristics do these farmers and farm managers share in common that are quite different from most of the rest of the group? And similarly with the 1s and 2s, what are the common characteristics amongst those farms that are not enjoying the level of success that we believe should be possible? And then also asking the questions, what are the similarities between the two groups? And what are the big differences between these two groups? So this was a fascinating exercise, and we've repeated this same exercise year after year after year, asking the same set of questions about the exact same growers. And we learned an awful lot really fast. We learned a lot about agronomy. I still remember, I want to, if I recall correctly, it was 2011 or 12, where we realized that all of the growers, or most of the growers in the number 1 and number 2 category who were not enjoying the degree of agronomic success that we thought should be possible, were making foliar applications with poor quality water. And so that was kind of our first revelation of how extremely important water quality is for foliar applications of nutrients. So that's just one example. Over after doing the same exercise year after year, we learned a lot about agronomics and how to make sure that all the farms that we work with were having very strong success. However, over the last 4 years, perhaps even the last 5 years that we have repeated this exercise, what has emerged, the commonalities between the groups of 9s and 10s and the differences from those leading groups versus the groups who were not having the same level of success. All of a sudden, the differences that started showing up were no longer differences about agronomics. They were no longer differences of using, for example, using hard water or poor quality water for foliar applications. Instead, the differences that started showing up were differences in the management characteristics of how were growers managing their operation. So after repeating this exercise for several years, we developed a group of core characteristics that really describe this group of very successful farm managers And how is it that they manage differently, and how do they spend their time and energy differently from many of the other farmers who might perhaps not be enjoying the same degree of success? So those are the pieces that I want to talk about tonight. So let's dive into it. What are the characteristics that really define exceptionally successful farm managers? What is it that they do differently from most farm managers? Why is it that this group of farm managers has such exceptional success? They may be next door neighbors to growers who have rain damage, who have hail damage, and things happen to these growers as well, environment and climate impacts that are beyond their control. But consistently, side by side, when compared with growers growing the exact same crops, the exact same neighborhood, they consistently outperform those growers. What are the characteristics that those growers share, and why does that happen? Well, we observed that there were a number of very startling characteristics, and perhaps one of the biggest pieces that really stood out was how they thought about money and the finances on their farm, and how that influenced their behavior and their priorities, because they prioritized their personal time and energy and the things they learned about completely differently based on their interactions with money and how they thought about managing money and managing the finances on the farm. So when you, obviously, as we know, agriculture and farming is a challenging profession. It's very generally, for most of the crops that we're growing, we're talking about very large volumes, very tight margins. There's not a lot of room to wiggle margin-wise, and we need to manage costs very carefully. But we observed that there was a strong polarity between the most successful growers and those who were not enjoying the same degree of success in the way that they thought about managing their farm's balance sheet, or managing their farm's P&L, I should say. So, as you know, if you want to balance a budget on any enterprise, then particularly in an environment such as this one, or a business type such as this one, you have two major categories that you can play with. You can focus on increasing revenues, or you can focus on reducing costs. And obviously, in the agriculture environment, you can't ignore either of those. You have to pay close attention to costs. You have to pay very close attention to revenues. But we discovered that the most successful farm managers thought about these two categories completely differently from most of the growers that we were working with. Most growers became personally engaged and spent a lot of their personal time and personal energy managing costs. And they focus very heavily on the cost side of the budget and reducing costs, reducing inputs. They made that their personal responsibility. Then, and that's where, in terms of managing the overall operations finances from a financial perspective, that is where they've spent perhaps 80% of their personal focus on the financial spectrum. Increasing revenues is an area that the less successful farm managers spent a little bit of time on. It was very important to them, but in this area, they would delegate a lot. So they would delegate to crop consultants and to veterinarians and to agronomists to make recommendations for what nutrients to be applied, or what cover crops to be planted, or whatever the case might be, to look at various tools and practices that they might be able to use to increase revenue. So they would invest personally, perhaps 20% of their own time and energy investing or focusing on increasing revenue, and 80% of their personal energy on reducing costs. And they would delegate most of the increasing revenue component to consultants and to people on their team that they were working with. This was in stark contrast to the most successful growers. The most successful growers would do the exact opposite. They would delegate many of the cost cutting side and managing costs. They would delegate that to their accountants, to their farm managers. They didn't ignore it. They still stayed on top of it. They still paid close attention. They made sure that they were on track, but they delegated most of the responsibility and the priorities. But on the side of increasing revenue, they made sure that they understood how to increase revenue on the farm personally, very deeply. They absolutely categorically refused to delegate that responsibility to anyone else. So, in fact, this was so pronounced. I think this is a characteristic that's worth talking about for a little bit. So, for every crop, even if you're growing a commodity crop like corn or soybeans, there are always a number of key pieces that directly affect revenue of the crop that you're producing. And this is even more true for fresh market crops such as fresh market fruits and vegetables. So let's say if you are growing blueberries, for example, then the value of your blueberry crop is, particularly if you are shipping it for an extended distance, is based on size and firmness, particularly firmness. In fact, in some parts of the country, blueberries are compensated and you get premiums for firmness. If you're growing wheat, for example, you get premiums in many parts of the country for producing higher protein content wheat. With commodity crops such as corn, you get premiums for producing high test weight corn, or in some cases on soybeans, high oil content, whatever the case might be. My point is simply that for many different crops, for most crops, there are key quality characteristics that bring a premium either directly or indirectly. With corn, for example, you don't get compensated directly for increased test weight. They don't pay, most cooperatives don't pay for increased test weight, but increased test weight directly translates to increased yield. And so you do get compensated for it in a very immediate fashion. So the question these very successful growers ask themselves is, how do I make money with this crop? They understand these quality characteristics, whether it's increased firmness, increased protein content, increased test weight, whatever the characteristic might be. And they make certain that they personally know and understand that specific characteristic very deeply. They do not delegate that to anyone else. They don't delegate that knowledge to a consultant or an agronomist or an advisor. They certainly have consultants and agronomists and advisors and people on their team that they work with, but they want to make sure that they understand that specific piece personally. So in terms of the most successful growers and their time allocation to managing the economics and the finances of their farm, the most successful growers spend roughly 20% of their personal energy thinking about reducing costs and 80% of their time and energy thinking about how to increase revenue. They delegate most of the cost side and they personally take responsibility for the revenue side. This is in exact opposite to the less successful growers. The less successful growers spend about 20% of their personal time and energy thinking about how to increase revenue, and about 80% of their personal time and energy thinking about how to reduce costs. So this was one that really stood out for us very, very strongly. The second piece that was really intriguing for us that really stood out was the difference in implementation and execution. The most successful farm managers demanded perfect implementation and execution from themselves and also from their employees. And what I mean by that, obviously, we are in an industry where we're talking about an industry where there's things always go wrong, and there's always weather and climate and stuff to deal with. But when it came to developing infrastructure on a farm, trellising trees, putting up a hoop house, putting on a foliar application, setting pipe for irrigation, whatever activity was needed or necessary, they expected perfect execution. The rows needed to be perfectly straight or perfectly on contour. The execution, they demanded the best of execution, both of themselves and of their employees. Another very intriguing difference was their planning for the future of their operation and the things that they wanted to be working on. So the most successful managers we saw consistently, they would be thinking into the future and about projects that they wanted to work on in the future. So they might be thinking about what a new type of trellising and managing trees might look like in the future, or new varieties for a crop that they're growing, like strawberries or tomatoes, or new types of growing systems. So they're constantly looking for new technology, new ideas, and they're thinking about where the industry that they are in is going to be in 3 to 5 years from now or longer. So they're thinking into the future, more longer term. And generally we find that the less successful growers are thinking at the most about 12 to 18 months in advance of what their crops they want to be growing and what the future of those crops might be on the long term. There was another very interesting characteristic that tied back to our first point of delegation versus personal engagement in managing or increasing revenue versus reducing costs. Once a grower identified the critical pieces, the critical points that had an impact on increasing revenue, they wanted to understand precisely what was happening inside the plant from a physiological perspective. Are we talking about kernels at a specific stage of kernel development? What influences that stage of kernel development? How can I change it? How can I increase test weight, protein content? They would pay very close attention to those pieces. And then the extension from that is they would focus on developing manageable data. And when I say manageable data, what I mean is they would identify a specific point, a specific characteristic. So let's just say, for the sake of discussion, that increasing protein content in wheat. After reading the literature and speaking to a group of advisors and consultants, a farmer might identify that increasing protein content on wheat is related to the mineral balance of 6 key minerals at a specific stage of plant development. I'm making up a hypothetical example. That grower would then make absolutely certain that rather than just saying, okay, I need to make sure that plants have enough of these 6 minerals, I'm going to go out there and foliar feed all my acres with these 6 nutrients just before this time period. They wouldn't take a blanket shotgun approach, but instead they would say, okay, how can I know exactly what the nutritional requirements are of this plant at this stage of development? So I think a challenge that we have in some parts of agriculture is we develop a lot of data, but it doesn't necessarily transfer readily into making management decisions. We can have all the data in the world, but what do we do with it? How can we transfer it into actually making a difference on a farm? So the most successful growers have no desire to have a lot of data just for the sake of having a lot of data. They want to have data about those specific points that they know they can and need to influence in order to increase revenue. So that is a major piece that they focus on very intensely. Another intriguing characteristic of these exceptionally successful growers was the amount of time they spent learning. Just in observations and watching them, I would suggest somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5 to 10% of their time was spent learning, attending conferences, going to field days, reading books, talking to people on the phone, all these various activities, they were very inquisitive about learning new information that would help them manage their crops better. Sometimes in agriculture is very much it's a legacy business. And in that, many growers and many farmers see it as much more than just the opportunity to make money. It's also their home, it's for their family, and they have a strong desire to leave a legacy behind. And that is an incredibly valuable mindset and mind frame from many different perspectives. However, it sometimes can lead to being resistant to change. So it can lead to farmers and to growers not wanting things to change from the way they have been. And so somebody sent me a quote recently that kind of cracked me up a little bit. And the quote was that there are some people who are open to progress, but resistant to change. So they're open to having progress happen, but they don't personally want to change. They want it to happen to other people. And this characteristic absolutely does not define the most successful growers. These are growers that are extremely adaptable. In many cases, they are early adopters. They're constantly looking for new ideas and new technologies that they can adopt and implement on their operation. There is one mantra that we heard repeated over and over again from these early adopters, where they may have a bit more of an appetite to try new things. They're more comfortable with the risk of trying new things, and conducting a pilot, running some trials, testing things on their own operation. And this was a mantra that was quite common. Think big, start small, and scale fast. So when experimenting with new technologies and new ideas, they might conduct a trial on a small part of their total operation, but then the moment it demonstrated performance and effectiveness, they would scale that very, very quickly across their entire operation, where they might increase, they might go from 3% of their acres one year to 80 or 90% the second or third year. So they would scale very, very quickly once they were satisfied that whatever new technology they were testing was working very well for them. So all those pieces that I discussed now are, up to this point, are relatively logical, straightforward, and you might be thinking, oh, they're not such a big deal. But intriguingly enough, there are a couple of those characteristics that I talked about that many farmers consistently fail to apply. But this next group, two more characteristics that are not commonly talked about. They are not necessarily logical. They catch many people by surprise initially, and then when they start to think about them, I often get the response, "Oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about." The first characteristic in this group is that the most successful growers, the most successful farmers, develop a deep intuitive connection to the crops that they're growing. And this is a characteristic that we're particularly in agriculture and farming, we're very comfortable talking about this in the context of animal agriculture, but many people have been sometimes less comfortable talking about it in the context of working with plants and crops in the field. So you're working with a dairy farmer in my community when I was growing up, and even today, many dairy farmers there would still be a lot of small scale dairies that would have their breeding, their upper end cows, the cows that they were taking really good care of, would still be in tie stalls. So many of these smaller scale dairies, it would be completely normal for a farmer to walk into a tie stall barn with 2 rows of cows. All the cows are standing there, patiently waiting to be fed. They all look essentially identical. And he would point at one cow and say, there's something wrong with that cow. And there is absolutely no visual indication that we can quantify that something is wrong with that cow. But the farmer will work with her and treat her and hopefully get her to recover before she becomes worse. And in the dairy farming world, this is very common. It's considered to be a characteristic of good dairy employees and good dairy managers, that they pay very close attention to the animals that are in their care. I'm using cows as an example, but the same holds true for sheep or chickens or hogs or anything else. Perhaps not chickens and hogs in large scale operations. And of course, everything that I'm describing for animals is true if you have an operation small enough to facilitate a bit of connection. But we find that the most successful growers have this same type of connection to the crops that they're working with. For example, we might be working with, might be walking with a grower through an orchard, and we get to one block and the grower will say something like, I have no idea what's going on with this block, but it just doesn't feel right. This block doesn't feel good. Something is wrong, something is off. And he can't really quantify why he feels that way. That there is not a specific indicator that he can point to say, this is off, this is a problem. He may look for indicators to try to justify why he is feeling a certain way. So anyway, without belaboring the point any further, I would just want to say that it's become very clear that the most successful growers are growers who actively try to have that connection to their crops and to try to pay very close attention to what's happening and what's going on in the field, to the point where they can feel when something is off, even when they may not be able to articulate it with words. And that intuitive connection then leads to the second major characteristic, which really defines these exceptional managers, is they acknowledge and begin resolving the internal dissonance between their ideals and their core values and some of the decisions that they feel forced to make on a day-to-day basis. What do I mean by that? Well, when I speak with growers and I ask them the question, why do you farm? What is it that attracted you to farming? You could have chosen many other professions. You could have chosen to leave at any point, but you've chosen to remain in a profession that is really challenging. It's a lot of hard work. There's long hours. The pay is uncertain. Why did you choose to continue farming? And when I begin unwrapping the answers and digging a little bit deeper, the common theme that emerges is many growers have a strong desire to be connected to life and living processes. They love watching seeds germinate in the spring, watching the joy of a newborn animal bouncing around, listening to the songbirds as they migrate back in the spring, watching flowers bloom. These connections to living processes and living systems are really at the foundation of why many farmers chose to remain in farming. The challenge is that since the Green Revolution, particularly in the last 50 years, we have adopted a model of agriculture that is directly antagonistic to these core values, where we have a model of agriculture that is very much based on a warfare mentality of search and destroy. Identify a specific pest, identify a specific pathogen, and figure out how you can kill it. And if you're not successful with the first weapon of choice, you simply get a bigger bomb, get a stronger pesticide, get a stronger fungicide. So on one hand, we have this deep core value and this desire to produce healthy, high quality food and to do a really good job, to leave a legacy for our children and our grandchildren for the future, to improve soil health. We have a desire and we have these ideals and these core values to produce a much higher quality product than that doesn't have any negative impacts on people, doesn't have any negative impacts on the land. And so that's on one hand, those are our ideals and our core values. But on the other hand, we are often in a position where we feel the need to apply pesticides and to apply products that we know are damaging to our soil health. We know have the potential to be damaging to the people who are consuming that food. And so this is what I refer to as the internal dissonance, the dissonance between our ideals and the choices that we feel forced to make. So what I've observed with the most exceptional farm managers who are doing a really great job is they recognize the internal dissonance. They don't necessarily make an immediate switch or change, and I would be the last to recommend that. They don't all of a sudden one day wake up and say, okay, I'm never going to apply any pesticides ever again. Instead, they say, oh, that's why I've been feeling the way that I've been feeling, this deep sense of this subtle sense of discomfort. And so I'm making it my goal, my personal goal is to get to a point where I can really live the core values and the ideals that I have, where I no longer need to apply pesticides because I really want to leave a legacy for the future. So I want to actively begin working towards that. And I want to begin learning about how I can reduce pesticide inputs and really achieve the goals that I have around my personal ideals and my personal core values. Every single time when a grower recognizes that and begins thinking about it, how can I begin farming and growing crops in a way that aligns with my core values and begins working towards that, they become incredibly fulfilled. They begin having a lot of fun, and there is a lot of passion and spark in those growers that is contagious, and they're really fun people to be around because they're learning new things, they are excited, and there is an incredible level of enthusiasm. They are having a ton of fun. They love what they do. And so I think that is one characteristic that that I have spoken to many different groups of farmers and growers over the years, all over the United States and North America, and internationally. And what I've observed very clearly is that there are some groups, sometimes you go to a conference or a trade show and the energy is down. It's just flat. People are talking about disease challenges and insect challenges and weather challenges, always weather challenges. And there's a sense of pessimism. And then sometimes you go to other conferences where there is an overwhelming sense of optimism and enthusiasm, and people love what they do and they're really fulfilled in the work that they're doing. And invariably, those conferences where people are really fulfilled and have a strong sense of optimism are the events where generally farmers have begun moving towards farming after their own ideals and after their own values. And I know that many of the growers that we work with as a company are not organic. There are also many that are, but most are not. But I will say that the energy and the spirit at an organic farming conference or a regenerative agriculture or a no-till farming conference as compared to a conventional mainstream agriculture conference is completely different. And I would invite anyone, if you haven't If you haven't participated in one of those non-mainstream events, I would suggest that you participate sometime just to get a sense for what I'm describing and talking about. It's a very valuable and very worthwhile use of your time. So I'm going to stop. Those are the major points that I wanted to share. And I would love to get your feedback and your comments and your input. I would like to invite you to subscribe to our podcast, a new podcast that we just launched last week. And I've been having a lot of fun with the podcast, enjoying it tremendously. We've had some awesome interviews with Michael McNeil, Gabe Brown, Tom Dykstra, Bob Kramer are posted so far. We have upcoming interviews with Don Huber and others, which will be released over the next several weeks. But we have, I'm really excited about the discussions that we've had so far, because we have had some very talented, extremely talented guests who we have talked about some incredible topics, and topics such as Tom Dykstra was explaining precisely how insects detect unhealthy plants and how plant and insect communication systems work. With Michael McNeil and Bob Kramer, we talked about how to develop disease suppressive soils and rapidly regenerate soil health. There's just a number of really fascinating conversations from some leading scientists in the field, and I'm certain that you would absolutely love it and enjoy it. So please subscribe for updates. You can go to regenerativeagriculturepodcast.com and put in your email address, and we'll send you an update, an email every time we post a podcast. So thank you for doing that. Really appreciate it. One of the pieces that I could perhaps expand on, just because it's so important, is the very first piece that I talked about, how prioritizing the finances of a farm changes a grower's behavior or changes a grower's priorities around where they spend their personal time and energy. So let me give you an example that I'm intimately familiar with, which is cherry production. Cherry growers are directly compensated for size and firmness. So producing large, firm cherries is a direct result of understanding the overall tree physiology, but then in particular, understanding what is happening at the cell division and cell expansion phase. And so the most successful growers focus on understanding that piece of fruit tree physiology really, really well. They will ask questions about what is happening at cell division and cell expansion and try to understand that piece and personally know that and understand it and not delegate it to someone else. Greg asked a question, any suggestions on how to best work with your advisor to be timely with recommendations? During the growing season, everyone gets very busy. So the system, the protocol that we work with at AEA, we've actually developed software to automate this process and make it a lot easier. And it's obviously an ongoing development process. But in essence, the way that we work with growers is once a SAP analysis report comes in, we turn the report around within 24 hours. And immediately, we begin at the beginning of the year with an outline of these are the applications that we believe will be appropriate for this plant at this stage of development based on what we know about plant physiology generally. So we already have kind of a base outline, a base template that shifts and changes throughout the growing season. And then based on SAP analysis, we will make specific adjustments to say, okay, we thought we were going to require this, but we need to make changes to 2 out of the 5 ingredients. We need to increase one by 50% and eliminate a second one altogether. So we'll make those adjustments, and we try to get those turned around very quickly, usually within 24 to 48 hours. And all of that happens mostly over email and also phone calls and conversations when we're working with growers remotely. When we're working with growers in the field, and that can happen even faster. Tyler asked the question, do I have any observations on how successful farm managers interact and manage the human elements on their farm employees? Tyler, this is a great question. I had it on my list to talk about, and I took it back off again. Yes, the short answer is yes. I do have some observations, and the most successful farm managers have very close, very personal relationships with their employees, bordering on being family, bordering on being family. So they have very close, very personal relationships with all of their employees. They have very high expectations of their employees. They have high expectations of themselves, but they have very close relationships, including they have close relationships, as close as is feasible, with all of the seasonal workers that come in just for harvest or for a specific task. So they work hard to have a very close connection with the people in their operation, in their organization as well. All right. Well, I want to thank all of you for attending. Thank you for your participation. I hope that you've enjoyed the discussion tonight. And please do subscribe to the podcast and listen to it on iTunes. And if you could, would very much appreciate it if you could also leave a review on iTunes, because that helps give us additional credibility and brings us out into the mainstream a little bit more. So thank you very much for attending. I hope you found this insightful and useful, and I hope to speak with all of you very soon. Have an awesome evening. Thanks, everyone. Bye.